What the hell is the Prime Minister going on about?
I will start with an apology on behalf of the British to each and every one of you.
I think that was a question well worth asking, which is a question.
He has it. My pub. Go on. Calm yourself down. Get out of my
Keir,
pub.
Prime Minister, from tomorrow, new sentencing guidelines will discriminate against white men before judges. What are you going to do about
He has in fact been
to
see a Keir.
A growing number, last number I know, 133 Labour MPs demanding that the Prime Minister recognises.
I implore members opposite to park the opportunism. I know the Honourable Member for Stretford and Irvington thinks this is a good crisis which the Labour Party should exploit. And I know she speaks for a lot of her front bench colleagues. Says that. You just need to see it in the support, U-turn, oppose approach that's characterised that high-heavy behaviour. But, excuse me, did the Honourable Lady Scum?
Order!
We want our country now. We want our country.
Chaos erupts outside Downing Street just moments ago. A crowd that had been restless for hours suddenly turned explosive. The second Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, stepped into view. What should have been a calm, controlled appearance spiralled into a vicious confrontation. Broadcast live across the nation, boos, chants and roaring outrage drowned out every word, leaving security scrambling and the Prime Minister visibly shaken. This wasn't just a protest, this was a message, and what happened next stunned even the reporters covering the scene. Just 1 minute ago, tension that had been quietly boiling outside Downing Street finally snapped the moment Keir Starmer appeared at the gates, triggering an eruption of noise that echoed like thunder through the narrow streets of Westminster. Reporters were still adjusting their cameras when the first wave of boos rolled through the crowd, loud enough to cut through every microphone broadcasting live. Starmer paused just briefly, but even that small hesitation was enough to fuel the storm brewing around him. The crowd surged forward, tightly packed, voices rising with anger and frustration as chants spilled over each other, creating a wall of sound impossible to ignore. People who had been standing silently moments earlier suddenly found themselves shouting, pointing, demanding answers. Their patience worn thin after days of political turmoil and government gridlock. As Starmer attempted to move closer to deliver his planned remarks, a sudden conflict near the front line between police and furious protesters caught the attention of every camera. The shoving, the raised hands, the echo of someone yelling, "Stop hiding!" All of it added to the escalating chaos. Security immediately tightened around the Prime Minister, forming a protective barrier as the atmosphere devolved into something raw, unpredictable and dangerously unstable. Starmer tried to speak, but his voice disappeared beneath the avalanche of booing, jeering and the relentless chant that spread like fire across the gathering. "We want answers!" His expression, normally controlled and steady, shifted into something sharper, frustration mixed with disbelief, as he realised the crowd was not going to let him regain control of the moment. Live broadcasters began narrating the scene as it unfolded, their voices shaken, unsure if the situation was about to spiral even further. Some described the clash as one of the most hostile receptions a British Prime Minister had faced in years, while others speculated what this sudden eruption revealed about the country's growing unrest. The noise only grew louder, bouncing off the walls of Downing Street, making it impossible for Starmer to continue pretending the situation was manageable. A ripple of fear moved through the front rows of the crowd as uniformed officers raised their arms, trying to push people back, warning them to stay behind the barriers. But the frustration was too high, the anger too sharp, the sense of betrayal too deep. Meanwhile, inside the Downing Street press room, journalists watched the chaos unfold in real time on screens, whispering among themselves, sensing that this was no ordinary political encounter. This was a moment that could shift public opinion overnight. Starmer's team signalled for him to fall back, but the Prime Minister refused, stepping forward again as if forcing the crowd to confront him. Yet every attempt he made to speak only triggered louder boos, harsher shouting, and a growing sense that control was slipping from his hands. The scene was turning into a symbolic clash between the government's confident statements and the people's rising impatience, between polished speeches and raw public anger. And as the cameras captured Starmer standing in the middle of a storm he could no longer calm, one thing became undeniably clear. Whatever happens next will not just shape tonight's headlines, it will shape the future battle for Britain's leadership. As the chaos outside Downing Street intensified, the atmosphere shifted from loud unrest to something far more dangerous, an unpredictable mix of anger, fear and political frustration that no one, not even the Prime Minister's security team, seemed prepared to handle. Moments after Starmer attempted to speak again, another wave of boos tore through the air, sharper and more aggressive than the first, forcing him to pause once more as the crowd pressed against the metal barriers with such force that officers had to lock their shields together. Camera crews scrambled to reposition as protesters climbed onto steps, railings, and anything they could use to get a clearer view of the confrontation. It was becoming clear that this was not merely about one speech or one political decision. This was the release of pent-up fury that had been building across the country, now exploding live on national broadcast. Starmer's aides moved closer, whispering urgently, but the Prime Minister pushed them away with a frustrated gesture, determined to regain control of the moment. Still, nothing he did could break through the wall of noise. In the crowd, tempers flared as arguments erupted between those demanding immediate answers and others urging calm, but the louder voices always drowned out the softer ones. At the same time, police radios crackled non-stop, transmitting warnings about rising tension on both ends of the street, where more demonstrators were flooding in after seeing the live footage on their phones. Meanwhile, reporters tried desperately to make sense of the unfolding scene, describing it as the most heated confrontation the country had witnessed since the last major demonstrations. And the images were already spreading across social media with lightning speed. Clips of Starmer's strained expression and the brutal chorus of boos went viral within minutes, drawing thousands of comments that reflected the same division pulsing through the crowd. Inside number 10, senior advisors watched the screens in disbelief, their faces tight with worry as they realised how damaging this moment could become if the situation didn't calm soon. But outside, the storm only grew stronger. A brief scuffle broke out near the right flank when a protester attempted to jump the barrier, triggering a rapid response from officers that only fueled the crowd's outrage. People shouted accusations of heavy-handed tactics, and every shove, every raised voice, every movement seemed to add another spark to an already volatile atmosphere. Starmer stepped forward again against security advice and tried once more to speak over the noise, but this time the boos mutated into a fierce chant that shook the entire street. His attempt to project authority backfired instantly, making him appear cornered rather than commanding. The crowd sensed it too. They could see the pressure forming cracks in his calm facade. As the chanting grew louder, hitting like waves against him, Starmer's voice finally broke, and for the first time he looked genuinely overwhelmed, not angry, not defensive, overwhelmed. It was a rare moment of vulnerability captured live for millions to see, and it sent a ripple of shock through both his supporters and critics. The chaos around him seemed to freeze for a second as everyone watched, waiting to see if he would retreat, push back, or lose control entirely. And in that single pause, a realisation settled over the entire crowd and every reporter filming the moment. The confrontation had escalated far beyond a simple disagreement. It had turned into a symbol of the deep, widening disconnect between the people and the power inside Downing Street. The stage was set for something even bigger, something that could not be undone, and as Starmer finally stepped back with a stiff, tense expression, it was clear the next moments would decide whether this crisis calmed or exploded even further. As Starmer retreated a few steps, the tension gripping Downing Street tightened like a rope pulled to its limit, ready to snap with the slightest tug. The crowd, emboldened by the Prime Minister's visible retreat, erupted again with a force that shook the entire atmosphere, turning the narrow street into a fierce battleground of voices demanding answers, truth and accountability. Security teams exchanged quick signals, preparing for the possibility that the situation could break into something far worse if the anger spreading through the protesters wasn't contained. The chants grew harsher, echoing against the historic buildings, creating a deep, thunderous rumble that made even the police shift uneasily. Behind the cameras, journalists whispered urgently to their producers, reporting that the Prime Minister looked shaken, cornered and unable to regain control. An image that was now broadcasting live to millions. Several commentators began openly questioning whether this confrontation marked the most intense challenge Starmer had faced since entering office. And the idea alone fueled even more intensity among those gathered outside the gates. Meanwhile, inside the crowd, smaller clashes broke out as frustration boiled over. Arguments flared between groups. Pushing and shoving spread like sparks across dry grass, and officers rushed to separate people before the situation escalated too far. Yet every attempt to calm the crowd was drowned in noise. The protesters felt the weight of the moment. Many sensed that this was their chance to force the government to hear what they had been trying to say for months. Every time Starmer lifted his head, trying again to steady himself, the sound of collective anger crashed over him. His security team formed a tighter ring around him, but Starmer held up a hand, signalling for them to wait. He wanted to prove he was not afraid, not backing down, not running from the people or from the pressure. But even as he stepped forward once more, the air crackled with tension. A plastic banner pole snapped in the middle of the crowd, mistaken by many as something far more serious, sending a wave of panic rippling forward. The police instantly pushed their shields up, preparing for the worst, while the crowd roared louder, misinterpreting the sudden movement as a threat. Starmer froze for half a second, his eyes darting across the chaos, his jaw tightening as the reality of the situation finally hit him. He had lost control of the moment completely. Cameras zoomed in on his face, catching the exact moment the weight of the situation pressed down on him. Analysts watching from studios miles away called it a career-defining crack. A silent admission that the pressure outside Downing Street had reached a dangerous peak. At that same moment, a wave of chants shifted tone, turning from anger to something more unified, more chilling. Direct demands aimed right at Starmer's leadership, echoing through the heavy air and bouncing off the black iron gates like a national warning. A reporter whispered on a still live microphone that this moment could mark a political turning point, a shift in the public mood that no amount of speeches or press statements could reverse. And the longer Starmer stood trapped in the noise, the more undeniable it became that this confrontation was no longer just a protest. It was a message from a frustrated nation delivered in a roar that refused to be ignored. As the wind cut down the street, carrying the sound of thousands of voices to every corner of Westminster, Starmer finally lowered his eyes for a moment, as if accepting that the next steps he took could change the course of his premiership. The tension was thick, the pressure overwhelming, and the crowd sensed he was on the edge of a breaking point. Everyone waited, breath held, for his next move, because it would determine whether this crisis would settle or explode into something historic. In the final moments of the tense standoff outside Downing Street, the atmosphere twisted into a heavy, almost suffocating silence, not because the crowd had calmed, but because its anger had reached a point where every shout carried the weight of thousands more waiting behind it. As Starmer stood there trapped between the furious protesters and his anxious security team, a sudden shift rippled through the street when a loudspeaker crackled from somewhere deep within the crowd. A voice boomed through the square, repeating the same demands the people had been shouting all evening, but now amplified, unified, and impossible to ignore. The chants spread like wildfire, every syllable echoing with a cold clarity that made even the police glance uneasily at one another. Starmer's shoulders tightened as he realised the confrontation had escalated into something far larger than Downing Street. This was becoming a nationwide rallying cry. He opened his mouth as if preparing to respond, but the crowd surged again, forcing officers to brace against the barriers with all their strength. A few protesters pushed forward, shouting directly at the Prime Minister, their faces flushed with emotion, their voices cracking from hours of yelling. Starmer's team made a split-second decision and stepped in, urging him to withdraw before the situation became irreversible. But the Prime Minister hesitated, torn between the instinct to protect himself and the fear that stepping back now would be broadcast as a symbol of failure. Cameras captured every detail, his clenched jaw, his trembling breath, the flicker of doubt in his eyes as the crowd's pressure mounted like a wave preparing to crash. Suddenly, a flare of chaos broke out on the left as two protesters clashed violently, drawing police attention and triggering a chain reaction of movement that made the entire crowd sway dangerously. The brief moment of disorder pushed security into action. They closed ranks around Starmer, guiding him toward the entrance of number 10, even as he attempted to resist. The booing grew louder, more furious, echoing across the centuries-old buildings like an accusation carved into stone. As Starmer neared the door, the crowd delivered one final deafening roar, a sound so powerful that it seemed to shake the ground beneath his feet. Journalists shouted questions, microphones thrust forward, trying to capture any last word or reaction before the door shut behind him. But he said nothing. Not a single sentence, not even a glance back. The heavy black door of Downing Street slammed shut, leaving the crowd outside roaring, with a mixture of victory, fury and unresolved frustration. Inside, the atmosphere was no less tense. Aides scrambled through hallways, phones ringing non-stop as news outlets across the country replayed the explosive footage on a loop. Analysts dissected every second of the confrontation, calling it a crisis moment, a blow to authority, a turning point that could reshape the next chapter of British politics. Meanwhile, outside, the protesters refused to disperse. Their chants continued, filling the night and carrying across the city like an echo of something brewing far beyond Westminster. For Starmer, the retreat into number 10 marked not an escape, but the beginning of a new and uncertain political storm. The boos outside Downing Street were more than anger. They were a warning that the public's patience had run out. And as the night deepened and the crowd's voices continued to shake the streets, one thing became unmistakably clear. What happened tonight would not fade quietly. It would follow him. It would haunt his leadership, and it would ignite a battle that was only just beginning.